Hey gang, I want to look at a couple of equations now and graph them. So we're going to start with some trig equations, sine, one cosine, and we're going to look at how do we graph them from the equation. So I'm going to start here with problem number 8 on page 14. We want to graph y equals 2 times the sine of 4 times x plus pi over 2, all minus 2. So what we're going to start with is we're going to start by identifying the different parameters here. So if we look at the equation, one thing to remember is our graphing form. Y equals a sine b times x minus h plus k. If we can remember that form, then it should be fairly easy to fill in these values here. So our a value is 2. Our b value is 4. We're going to come back to the period length in just a second. H value would be negative pi over 2. Remember, in the equation, it's the opposite of h. Okay? And then our k value would be negative 2. All right, now the period length, we're going to get that from using the b value. So the b value is 4. That tells us that within a distance of 2 pi, we're going to complete 4 cycles. So what we can do is we can use this idea of PB equals 2 pi. Okay? B is 4, so P times 4 equals 2 pi. So divide by 4, and P is 2 pi over 4, or pi over 2. Okay? So what we're saying is that if we can fit in 4 cycles in 2 pi, then each cycle needs to be pretty short. Each cycle can only be a half of a pi. Okay? So we've got everything we need there. Now, what I actually like to do is I like to ignore these graphs over here for just a minute, and I like to draw sine. What does sine look like? Okay, sine starts in the middle, goes up, goes down to its lowest point, and comes back up to the middle. And what I do is I just kind of label everything on this little graph, and then I transfer it down to one of these here. So I start off with my k value. My k value is negative 2, and that tells me the middle of my graph vertically. So I know that it's going to be at negative 2 vertically, the middle. My a value tells me how far I need to go from the middle to get to the top. So from negative 2, I need to go up 2. So I'm going to go up to a height of 0. And I need to go down 2 to get to my lowest point. So I'm going to go down to negative 4. So now I know vertically my whole graph is going to be contained between 0 and negative 4. So I'm not even going to use the positive portion of this graph. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my h value. My h value is negative pi over 2. That tells me that right here, where I'm starting sine, that's going to be at negative pi over 2. Okay. I also know that my period length is pi over 2, which means if I add my period length tells me how long it takes to complete one cycle. Negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2, that means I'm going to end here at 0. Okay? So I'm going to start at negative pi over 2 and end at 0 because my period length takes me a distance of pi over 2. Okay? So now I could label my axes here. Now this is the one thing I don't like about having pre-drawn graphs, is we're going to end up with some pretty scrunched data in here. So we've got these tick marks already on here for us. So if we say that this is negative pi over 2 and this is 0, then our entire our cycle is going to fit in between these 2 points. Okay, we're starting it at negative 2, so we're going to start down here at negative 2, and we're going to use the 5-point method. So we're starting here at negative 2, we're also ending at a height of negative 2, and we know that that's at 0. So we can put another point there. We also know that halfway in between, we're going to be at the same height. So halfway in between, We're at the same height. And then we know that in between these first 2 points that are in the middle, we can find another point that's going to be at the highest. And we know the highest is at 0. So halfway between these first 2 points here, we're going to put another point up at a height of 0. And then halfway between our last 2 points, we get our lowest point here, which we said would be at -4. So halfway between these 2 points, we can go down to -4. And now we just need to draw the graph. Okay. And there's our graph. Put an arrow on the end to show that it continues. And we could continue this graph. Okay. Now we're just starting our cycle over again. So the next point would be up here at 0. And then we'd be back down to -2. And then we'd be back down to -4. And then we'd be back up to -2. Okay. And that would take us another pi/2 to get there, because that's our period length. Okay. So we could keep drawing cycles if we wanted to. Okay. But usually I only need to see 1 or 2 cycles from you. Okay. So that is an example of how we could use an equation and the a, b, h, k values and the period length to help us graph it. Now we're going to take a look at a cosine equation. Okay, so I'm just going to clear that, and I'm going to come down here to a cosine equation. We're going to look at number 5 here. So cosine, same idea. You've got your a, your b, your h, and your k. So our a value is 3. Our b value is 2. Remember, this is the opposite of h, so that's going to be -pi/4. And our k value is -2. And then remember, pb equals 2 pi. So p times 2 equals 2 pi. Well, that must mean that p has to be pi. Pi times 2 would be 2 pi. So the period length is pi. So now I have everything I need. And just to make this one a little bit trickier, I'm going to change this equation slightly. I'm going to make it a -3. Okay. So then this would be a -3 as well. I'll have to adjust my graph over here a little bit, but it'll be fine. So now I'm going to think about cosine. Cosine normally starts at its highest point, goes down to its lowest point, and then ends back up at its highest point. But this has a negative out front, which tells me that it's flipped. So I'm actually going to flip this and start at the lowest point, go up to the highest point, and then come back down to the lowest point. And again, I'm going to start the same way I did for sine. I'm going to find that k value, which is the middle of the graph. K value is -2. Then I'm going to use my a value to find the highest and the lowest points. The a value is -3, but really the negative just tells us that it's flipped. The 3 is what tells us how much to go up and down. So we're going to go up 3 from -2. That's going to take us up to +1. And down 3 from -2 is going to take us down to -5. Okay. So the highest point is 1, lowest point is -5. Now to figure out where I'm starting here, I look at my h value, which was -pi/4. So I'm starting at -pi/4. And to figure out where I'm going to end, I need to add on my period length. My period length is pi. So basically, another way you can think of this is I'm taking pi and I'm subtracting pi/4. You have to be comfortable in putting pi and 2 pi and numbers like that into a fraction with different denominators. So pi would be 4 pi/4. So this is 4 pi/4 and a -1 pi/4. That's going to be +3 pi/4. Okay, so I'm starting at -pi/4 because my period length is pi, I need to add that, and I'm going to end at 3 pi over 4. So coming down to this graph here, I would label this negative pi over 4. So now every one of these tick marks is 1 pi over 4. So this would be 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4. And that's where I want to end. Now, I'm starting cosine here because I changed the equation to be negative. I'm starting at its lowest point, which is at negative 5, and my x value is negative pi over 4. So negative pi over 4, and I need to go down one more to negative 5. I'm also going to end at the same height, and we determined that that would be at 3 pi over 4. So I'm going to end out here at 3 pi over 4, also at negative 5. Halfway between those, we get the third point, which is the highest point on a cosine graph, in this case because it's upside down. That highest point is at 1. Halfway between negative 1 and positive 3 pi over 4 is positive 1 pi over 4. You can also, count the tick marks. We're going 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces, so halfway in between would be 2 spaces. That's 1 pi over 4, and we said that would be at its height of 1, the highest point of this graph. So now we have 3 points. The fourth point we're going to graph is in between these two, our lowest and our highest point here, and that's going to be in the middle of our graph at negative 2. So halfway between these 2 points would be 0, and then we want to be at a height of negative 2. And then halfway between our last 2 points, we get the fifth one that we're going to graph, and that's at the same height as the one we just graphed at negative 2. So now we have the 5 points that we need. Just be careful, you don't want this to look like a V, then people might think it's an absolute value graph. So you want to try to add on a little bit of curve to it so that people don't think it's an absolute value graph, so that it looks like a sine or a cosine graph. So there you've got a cosine graph. So again, just to kind of go through all the steps quickly, the first thing I'm doing when I'm graphing sine and cosine is I'm identifying what are A, B, H, K, and the period length. Okay. Then I'm coming up here and I'm just making a small graph off to the side because I can label all those things quickly. I just draw what does cosine look like, and then I plot. My K value is the middle of the graph. My A value tells me how high to go to get to the highest point, and how low to go to get to the lowest point from the middle. My H value tells me where to start my graph, and my period length tells me what I need to add to that H value to get to the end of my graph. And then once I have all of that information, it's just a simple process of transferring that graph down onto the grid below. Okay, so hopefully this helps with graphing sine and cosine functions.